The stones of the Cevahir Bazaar sighed to a different rhythm under the cool night. Moonlight slid like a silver ribbon across the domes. The brass of lamps and the glass of antique clocks in shop windows caught and scattered that light, throwing fractured reflections across the cobbles. For years, people hurried these alleys and glanced at display cases without seeing the space between them, a slender seam, like a barely visible crack where one stone refused to sit evenly against another. In that seam, if you knew to look, something waited. The young woman before it was Aylin. Her grandfather, Errol, had been a teller of small, improbable truths. He embroidered the bazaar's ordinary corners with impossible histories, a pomegranate tree that bore fruit shaped like coins, a carpet merchant who could hear the weather in the weft. He had kept for Aylin a softer secret, which he revealed on slow evenings with the kettle steaming between them. Time runs differently here, he would say, tapping the bruise of a knuckle against his temple as though it were an instrument to tune. Not faster. Not slower. Different. Like two hands playing the same song in different keys. Aylin had smiled and believed it a story, until the evening she stayed late. Searching for a chain that had escaped the tray in her small antique stall, the light she found was no more than a halo on the pavement. A faint, steady ring as if a tiny sun had sunk into the stone. It pulsed when she knelt, or perhaps it was her own breath that made it stutter. Within that halo a door's outline took shape, narrow planks of wood with a grain that ran like river lines. A little metal knocker whose face had been chased with miniature glyphs. And hinges so small they might belong to a cabinet rather than an exit. The wood was cool when she pressed her palm. It vibrated beneath her fingers, a calming, animal tremor, as if the door were breathing. Her heart, not so calm, tapped at her ribs, excitement braided with the older thread of dread. She remembered Errol's words, they opened to the right person. At the right moment. The thought tasted like an anchor. She pushed, the door did not swing. It unlatched, yielding a little confession of warmth, the smell of beeswax and leather, a hush that was not silent but full of listening. She stepped through and left the moon's pale rules behind. Inside, the air was thicker, saturated with dust and ink and a faint metallic tang of old brass. Shelves rose and rose, leaning inward like attentive listeners. Glass cases held small, precise things, lockets, tools. A tarnished watch chain, arranged as if on display for someone who looked with more than just eyes. A wooden counter occupied the center. And on it lay a pressed seal, still crisp with the memory of being struck. Near it, a stack of letters slumped against one another, their edges browned and edges softened by time. A single envelope slid free and drifted to her feet. The handwriting on it was Errol's, looped, impatient, they fell, in his name always taller than strict calligraphy allowed. She slid it open with a trembling thumb. Aylin, it began. The ink had faded to the color of spent tea. If you read this, the door has opened for you. Forgive me for leaving this burden to you. I waited as I promised I would, and I learned what patience can teach. Remember that this place keeps what is entrusted to it by memory and regret. Every opening demands a decision. You may step inside and ease a wound that has haunted our family, or you may remain a guardian here and prevent an alteration whose reach we cannot measure. I made my choice. Now it is yours. E. Her fingers closed around the brooch she had absent-mindedly lifted from a nearby case. It was Errol's brooch, a tiny clock face rendered in enamel encircled by filigree. The instant the metal met her skin, something unlatched not only in the room but in her chest. The wall swam. A smell of bread and tinned oranges rose, an anachronistic bouquet, and the carpet of time shifted underfoot. When she opened her eyes she was in another street entirely, though its outline matched the old photographs she'd seen in family albums. The tram rails ran slick with oil. Vendors shouted in lilting accents. Steam rose from a street kettle like a ghost signing its name. People moved in layers of dresses and coats that belonged to a different decade. Their faces, if she squinted, resolved into the features of the photographs, the arch of a brow, the slope of a nose, the faces made young again. A woman crossing the street paused, peered at Aylin with a look of recognition as if remembering a future she had not yet lived, and smiled, new. She asked in a whisper that was more a question between times. Yes, Aylin replied, and her voice sounded both foreign and right. The past had its own gravity. At first, it invited her with kindness. Afternoons in old cafes where men argued philosophy until the sun went down. A bookbinder who showed her the tiny art of sewing signatures and made her laugh at how much care went into the spine of a life. A shoemaker who told stories with a throat like a drum. She learned names, a musician whose fingers never stopped tapping. A seamstress who had little messages in hems, and each name felt like a thread in a tapestry. A thing she might gently tug to alter the image. She began to see Errol's younger self as if through a shallow glass, quick-handed. Eyes rimmed with a tired joy, hands that repaired. Not because he sought payment but because he couldn't bear to see things left undone. She followed him at a distance for a day, watching how he paused by a fountain to speak softly to someone whose face she never caught, how he insisted on paying for a child's loaf when a vendor haggled. In a market square, she watched a moment unfold that would become a scar in stories told years later. Errol, young, wanting, slightly defeated, saying goodbye at the edge of a stone fountain. At his side was a woman whose profile she knew from a photograph, Lael, who had been as bright as the spice jars she used to sell. Their exchange lasted perhaps a breath, and then the woman turned away, disappearing into a crowd that smelled like cumin and citrus. Aylin felt the urge to intervene like a tide. If she stepped forward and altered the sentence that passed between them, changed a word of comfort, held a hand instead of releasing it, could she smooth the creases in the future? Her mind supplied consequences in quick, meticulous rows, a grin from a child who now had a father, a different marriage, a street that hummed with another sound. But threads elsewhere tugged hard in reply, a neighbor's laughter she could not now imagine, a grief that might not open the heart that later learned compassion. The letter's warning, Errol's clipped admonition, unrolled in her memory like a map. You must choose, she told herself aloud in a small voice, testing the timbre. The woman from the photograph had once been real and would remain real whether or not she changed to goodbye. Choice felt, in that instant, less like power and more like stewardship. She spent days that were like pages in a book. If time here thickened like honey, her mind flowed around it, tasting and learning. She listened to Errol tell a friend about a youthful mistake that led to a kindness later on, to a wound that taught him restraint. She watched a child fall and be helped by a stranger whose act would inspire a lifetime of repair. Each event revealed a ripple she could scarcely imagine touching without changing an ocean. The temptation to shape the past returned like a tide. In a narrow bakery lit by dawn, she overheard a decision, small, sharp, a choice of work instead of flight, that would lay the foundation of a line of tradesmen. Aylin's hand hovered, wanting to nudge that decision toward a brighter, easier path for the hands she imagined warm and tired. She pictured telling the young baker a different story, leaving a note, slipping an extra coin into his till. But every small mercy she imagined came with a hypothesis of harm, a child who never learned to work, a woman never taught patience. The web of cause and effect congealed into a moral loom. When at last she stood again by the fountain and watched the farewell she had first seen, she felt like a listener at the end of a long conversation. She made a decision, not the heroic alteration she had dreamed, not the cowardly absence either, but a third kind of action. She stepped forward, not to change the words but to leave something small behind, a folded scrap of paper with an impossible, harmless truth: you are loved. Tucked beneath a loose stone. It felt, to her, like whispering a benediction rather than rewriting a fate. She walked away before their eyes could meet, back in the shop, back through the wooden frame whose grain had become familiar. She found the room exactly as she had left it. The same dust motes and the same slants of light, the same heartbeat tick. In her palm the brooch had lost the immediacy of the past but carried with it the warmth of something lived. The note from Errol lay on the counter, and beneath his signature she found, carefully pressed between the pages of a book on horology, a thin scrap of another's handwriting. It was dated the day after the fountain and read, simply, "The stone warmed that night." Errol's final line on the envelope glowed in her memory now: "With your choice you have mended both past and future. Time doors open to the courage of hearts." The words were not a decree but an observation. She understood then that courage was not always the dramatic act of salvation but sometimes the quieter holding of a thing as it is. She had not saved everyone, nor had she wrecked things. She had carried knowledge back like a lamp. When she closed the door behind her the stones of the bazaar breathed out. The moonlight returned as if no space had been opened at all. Errol's hand was warm on her shoulder when she reached the stall.